In the heart of the colourful village of Zumbari, where life buzzed through crowded markets and children played under the sun, lived a quiet man named Dambalo. He was a gentle tailor, the kind who smiled at strangers, stitched clothes with care, and never raised his voice. People respected him for his calm nature, but they also pitied him, because behind the walls of his home, his life was far from peaceful. Dambalo was married to Lugweta, a woman so large, loud and commanding that the entire village whispered her name with both fear and awe. Lugweta was not just big in body, her voice echoed like thunder, and her temper burned hotter than fire. She walked like a queen, talked like a soldier, and treated everyone, especially her husband, like a servant. Her strength was unmatched. She could carry sacks heavier than 2 men and fight like a wrestler. But it was her mouth that was most feared, sharp, cruel, and always ready to cut. For Dambalo, each day felt like walking through a storm. Lugweta ruled their home like a war general. If he forgot to boil her bathwater on time, slap. If the food wasn't hot enough, slap. If he dared to speak while she was talking, insult upon insult. She scolded him in front of neighbours, embarrassed him in the market, and once even called him a useless broomstick during a family gathering. And he just stood there, silent, small, and broken. The villagers couldn't help but whisper. They joked behind Dambalo's back, calling him the man who wore fear like a shirt. Children giggled when they saw him carrying Lugweta's bags, and elders shook their heads in disappointment. But none of them truly knew the pain he carried. To them, he was just the weak husband of the mighty Lugweta, a beast in a wrapper, wrapped in fine cloth but filled with fire. While most husbands in Zumbari held authority and pride, Dambalo's name had become a warning, a symbol of what happens when a man loses control in his home. And Lugweta? She enjoyed every bit of her power. She felt untouchable, believing her size, strength, and loud voice gave her the right to rule. What she didn't realize was that storms don't last forever, and sometimes the quietest ones carry the strongest thunder. Dambalo kept everything buried deep inside. Every slap, every insult, every moment of shame. He swallowed it like bitter medicine. By day, he stitched clothes with a steady hand and a forced smile, greeting customers with quiet warmth. But when the doors closed at night and the world outside went silent, his pillow soaked up his tears. No one saw that side of him. No one knew the pain that lived behind his soft eyes. He never told a soul the truth. Not his neighbors, not his customers, not even his own family. He wore his wounds like invisible scars, hidden beneath layers of silence and shame. His mother, Mama Endole, was the only one who ever sensed something was wrong. One day she came to visit and found Dambalo limping, his shirt slightly torn. When she asked what happened, he lied and said he slipped on the floor. But Mama Endole wasn't fooled. The next week, she came again, this time with words of warning for Lugweta. But before she could even finish her sentence, Lugweta grabbed a broom and chased the old woman out of the compound, yelling insults that echoed down the street. After that day, no one from Dambalo's family came back. They feared Lugweta, and Dambalo, broken and alone, told himself it was better this way, better to carry the burden than let it spread. Even when Chief Tambeke, the village head, tried to speak sense into him, he couldn't bring himself to act. The chief had pulled him aside once and said, "You are the man, act like one." But Dambalo didn't believe in fighting fire with fire. He didn't want war in his home. He believed, with all his heart, that love could change even a stone, that if he stayed patient, if he continued showing kindness, maybe, just maybe, Lugweta's heart would soften one day. He held on to that hope like a drowning man clings to a piece of wood. Every time she screamed, he stayed silent. Every time she hit him, he looked away. And every time she made him feel small, he reminded himself, this is just a test. She will change. But deep inside, his spirit was cracking. The man who once smiled with joy now only smiled to survive. The man who once dreamed of peace now only prayed for strength. And the worst part, no one saw it. To the world, Dambalo was just a quiet tailor. But behind closed doors, he was a man slowly fading, hoping for light in a room full of darkness. Lugweta ruled the house like a queen on a war throne, and Dambalo was her prisoner. He had no voice, no say, no freedom. Every coin he earned from his little tailoring shop went straight into Lugweta's hands. She decided what he ate, when he slept, and even how he walked in her presence. If he bought sugar without asking her, he was punished. If he spoke when she didn't approve, she'd shout until his ears rang. And sometimes, just because she was in a bad mood, she'd beat him right there in the yard, where everyone could see. One hot afternoon, as Dambalo sat outside fixing a ripped trouser, Lugweta stormed out of the house and slapped him so hard the needle flew from his hand. "Next time, you ask before you breathe," she growled, while the neighbors stared in shock. But no one dared speak, no one helped, because Lugweta had built a reputation of fear. Her fists were fast, her mouth sharper than any knife, and her temper unpredictable. Dambalo didn't cry, not in front of people, but the pain in his eyes screamed louder than any tears could. Things got worse when guests came. She would force Dambalo to kneel and serve them water like a houseboy. If he moved too slowly, she'd snap her fingers and shout, "Faster, fool!" Their daughter Ndera sat in the corner one day, her small eyes filled with confusion. She turned to her father and asked in a soft voice, "Papa, why does Mama treat you like her servant?" Dambalo couldn't answer. He just touched her head and smiled weakly. But inside, that question hurt more than all the slaps combined. Lugweta didn't care. In fact, the more people noticed her dominance, the more powerful she felt. Her friends, especially a loud woman named Kirani, would laugh and cheer her on. "You are the lioness of Zumbari!" they'd shout. "Show him who owns the house!" Lugweta soaked up the praise like honey. She walked taller, shouted louder, and ruled harder. But power made her reckless. One evening, as she sat with her friends, she joked about finding a real man, someone stronger, someone who could satisfy her needs. The others laughed, unaware that behind that laughter, Lugweta was serious. She had already started noticing a man named Torogo, a rough trader who came to the village once a week. She liked his muscles, his deep voice, and the way he looked at her like a challenge, and she believed Dambalo would never dare question her. After all, he couldn't even defend himself, let alone stop her. To Lugweta, Dambalo was nothing but a shadow, a man in name only, and she didn't realize that when you crush something for too long, it either breaks or explodes. That evening felt like any other. Dambalo returning home after a long day of sewing, tired and aching, only to be met with Lugweta's angry voice shouting from inside the house, "Where is my food, Dambalo? And don't forget the roasted yam and palm oil this time." Without a word, he rushed to the kitchen, gathered the heavy tray filled with multiple dishes, and began walking slowly towards her sitting mat. His arms shook from exhaustion, but he didn't stop. He had been trained by fear, to serve, to obey, to endure. Then it happened. Right there, a few steps from Lugweta's chair, Dambalo's knees buckled. The tray crashed to the ground, plates shattering, oil spilling like blood on the dusty floor. Dambalo fell beside it, unconscious. Lugweta jumped up, not out of concern but rage. "Look what you've done! You ruined everything!" she screamed, shaking his limp shoulders. But he didn't move. The neighbors, drawn by the noise, rushed in and carried his lifeless body out as Lugweta stood there stunned, not knowing what to say or how to explain. At the hospital, silence hung heavy in the room. The doctor, a kind young man named Dr. Kamutu, examined Dambalo and then sat quietly by his bedside. When Dambalo finally opened his eyes, weak and confused, the doctor leaned closer and whispered gently, "Your body is shutting down. This is not just physical, it's emotional trauma. If you keep everything buried, one day it won't just be a fall, it'll be your last breath." Those words stuck to Dambalo's heart like a cold wind. Emotional trauma. That's what it was. All the pain, the humiliation, the loneliness. It had eaten him from the inside, like slow poison. That night, alone in his hospital bed, the ceiling above him looked endless and cold. Machines beeped beside him. A dull ache throbbed in his back, but his heart ached more. For years he had told himself to stay quiet, to be the peacemaker, to wait for Lugweta to change. But lying there, weak and helpless, he realized nothing would ever change if he didn't. Tears rolled down his cheeks. He wasn't crying from pain. He was crying from the years lost, from the strength he never used, from the voice he never raised. And in that moment of raw honesty, he whispered into the silence, "God, give me the strength to stand up." Not in anger, but in truth. Something shifted in that moment. Not outside, but deep inside him. A seed had been planted, not of revenge, not of violence, but of courage. the kind of courage that grows in quiet hearts, the kind that wakes up after years of sleeping. Dambalo closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel afraid. He felt ready. Something was coming. Something that would change everything. Dambalo returned to the same old house, with the same loud voice waiting for him, the same heavy footsteps of Lugweta pacing like a lioness claiming her territory. But something inside Dambalo had changed. He didn't look at her the same way. He didn't flinch when her voice rose. He didn't rush when she clapped her hands or threw a plate in anger. Instead, he moved with a quiet calm that unsettled even Lugweta. At night, while the village slept and Lugweta snored, Dambalo began a new habit. He wrote letters to himself, not to send, not to show, but to feel, to heal. "You are strong, Dambalo," he wrote. "You were not born to live in fear." These letters became his secret voice, the one he had buried for too long. He began to pray deeper than ever before. His lips whispered to the heavens, not for revenge, but for strength, for clarity, for the power to rise without hatred. And slowly, something began to shift. Each sunrise brought a little more confidence. Each step he took felt less heavy. Then came the second part of his transformation. In the dead of night, behind their small compound, Dambalo started training his body. Push-ups, squats, lifting bags of sand, even practicing breathing exercises. At first, he could barely do 10, but he didn't stop. Every drop of sweat was like washing away the years of fear and pain. Lugweta noticed the change. She saw him eating better, walking taller, his silence no longer weak but powerful. She laughed one morning, pointing at his arms. "Look at the tailor trying to grow muscles. What next? You'll beat me with your needle and thread." Her friends cackled behind her. But inside, even she felt something was off. Dambalo's eyes didn't hold fear anymore. They held focus. Dambalo didn't reply. He didn't need to. Silence became his armor. Peace became his weapon. The man who once trembled at her footsteps now moved like a man with a mission. And though Lugweta still shouted, still bossed, still bullied, there was a small crack in her confidence. Because deep down, she could feel it. A storm was building. Not the kind that comes with thunder and lightning, but the quiet storm, the one that changes everything when no one expects it. And she had no idea that her reign over Dambalo was coming to an end. The village still laughed behind Dambalo's back, calling him the weak husband, the spineless tailor. But they hadn't seen the fire growing inside him. They hadn't read the letters soaked with tears. They hadn't heard the whispered prayers under the stars. Only he knew what was coming, and it was coming soon. It was a Sunday afternoon, like any other in the village of Zumbari. The sun was high, and the smell of grilled meat filled the air as family and neighbors gathered in Dambalo and Lugweta's compound. Everyone was enjoying the warmth of the day, chatting and laughing, but underneath the smiles, something was different. It was as though a quiet tension lingered, waiting for a spark. Lugweta, as always, was the center of attention. Her booming voice could be heard over the chatter, her eyes scanning the room as she barked orders. Dambalo, standing in the corner, quietly helped with the chores, keeping his head down. He had learned over the years to stay out of her way. But today, something inside him had shifted. He could feel it in his bones. The time had come. The moment that would change everything came suddenly. Lugweta, in her usual fashion, scowled at Dambalo as he handed her the wrong spoon. Her patience had worn thin. Without a second thought, she slapped him across the face, her hand cutting through the air with a sharp crack. The noise of her slap echoed through the compound, followed by the uncomfortable silence that settled over the guests. Everyone froze, but this time, Dambalo didn't flinch. Instead of looking down or shrinking back as he always had, he did something no one, not even Lugweta, expected. In one swift motion, he reached out and caught her hand mid-air, stopping her slap before it could land. For a split second, the world seemed to stand still. Everyone in the compound was watching, holding their breath. The laughter stopped. The chatter died. It was as if time itself had frozen, and the weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Lugweta looked at him in disbelief, her eyes wide with shock. She had always been the one in control, always the one who commanded respect with fear and force. But now, the man she had tormented for years stood before her, holding her hand with a quiet strength that shook her to her core. She tried to pull her hand away, but he held it firm. Dambalo stood tall, his eyes no longer filled with the helplessness they once held. There was something different about him now, something that came from years of pain, but also from the courage he had built within himself. He looked her straight in the eyes, his voice calm but powerful. "No more, Lugweta. This ends today." The words hit her like a thunderclap. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She trembled, not from fear, but from shock. She had never seen him like this. She had never imagined that the man she had tormented could stand up to her in this way. And then, without a word, Dambalo let go of her hand, turned, and walked out of the compound. For the first time in years, he walked away from her, from the house, from the life he had endured. As he stepped out into the sunlight, the crowd parted, watching in awe as he walked off into the distance. Lugweta stood there, frozen, unable to move, her hands still raised in the air. The compound was silent, except for the soft murmurs of the onlookers. Dambalo had done the unthinkable. He had fought back, not with violence, but with strength, dignity, and resolve. That day, everything changed. It was the day Dambalo finally took control of his own life. And Lugweta, she was left standing in the dust, unable to comprehend the shift that had just taken place. The moment Dambalo stepped out of his home, leaving behind the stunned silence of the compound, something remarkable began to happen. Word of his bold stand spread across Zumbari like wildfire. The once quiet village, which had always whispered about Lugweta's dominance over her husband, was now buzzing with energy. People began to talk, and for the first time, the topic of emotional abuse against men was being discussed openly, a topic that had been taboo for as long as anyone could remember. No one had ever imagined that a man like Dambalo, who had endured so much, could suddenly break free from the chains of silence. But now, his story was everywhere. It wasn't just the villagers who were talking. News spread quickly, and the world began to take notice. It all started when Tamuna, a local vlogger known for capturing the most unexpected moments, had been in the compound that day. She had arrived early to visit her family, just in time to catch the shocking turn of events. With her camera in hand, she recorded the entire scene, from Dambalo catching Lugweta's slap to his powerful words, "This ends today." Tamuna didn't waste a second. She posted the video online with the simple but powerful caption, "The day the tailor took back his crown." The words rang true in a way that no one expected. The video exploded across social media, shared by thousands who had never heard of Dambalo before, but were moved by his courage. It wasn't just a moment of triumph for one man. It became a movement, a symbol of the silent suffering so many others had endured but never spoke of. Within days, national news stations picked up the story. Reporters flooded into Zumbari, asking questions, taking footage, and interviewing villagers who had witnessed the moment. People in towns far away were now tuning in to hear about the man who had finally found his strength. They wanted to know more about the quiet tailor who had turned his back on years of torment without raising a hand in violence. Dambalo's name became known beyond the borders of Zumbari. He became the face of a silent struggle that so many men had faced but kept hidden. The story wasn't just about a man standing up to his abusive wife. It was about standing up to emotional oppression, to years of feeling weak and silenced. Dambalo had shown that you didn't need to fight back with anger or violence. Sometimes, peace and silence could be the most powerful weapon of all. The story resonated with countless people across the country and even internationally. Men who had suffered in silence, women who had seen the signs but didn't know how to help, and anyone who had ever felt powerless found strength in Dambalo's journey. As the world watched, Dambalo became a symbol of hope. He had reclaimed his crown, not with fists or threats, but with quiet strength, dignity, and the courage to walk away from the life that had held him captive for so long. His story was no longer just his own. It had become a rallying cry for those who had been overlooked, for those whose pain had never been acknowledged. And just like that, Dambalo was no longer the village joke. He was a hero. Lugweta's world crumbled as the days passed. The public exposure of her cruelty to Dambalo had turned the tables in ways she could never have imagined. Her once stronghold of power began to fade away, and the very people who had once supported her began to turn their backs. Her relatives, embarrassed by the shame she had brought upon the family, distanced themselves. They no longer came to visit, and the phone calls stopped. The laughter and playful conversations that had filled her home now felt like a distant memory. Her friends, once loyal and proud to stand by her side, also began to mock her behind her back. They whispered about the lioness of Zumbari, who had lost her strength and control. They no longer praised her dominance, but instead ridiculed her for the cruelty she had shown her husband, and now her own daughter. It wasn't just the villagers who had turned against her, it was everyone she had once trusted. But the most painful betrayal came from her own flesh and blood. Ndera, her young daughter, who had always been a silent witness to the battles between her parents, now refused to speak to her. The little girl, who had once been afraid to voice her concerns, now saw her mother for who she truly was. The betrayal of a daughter is a wound that cuts deep, and Lugweta could feel it. Ndera no longer looked at her with respect. There was only coldness in her eyes. It was a mirror image of the same fear and bitterness that Lugweta had forced Dambalo to endure for years. As Lugweta sat alone in her kitchen, the place where she had once ruled her family with an iron fist, the weight of her actions began to hit her. She had been the queen of this house, commanding every step, every word, every decision. But now, she was alone. No one was left to serve her. No one was left to obey her demands. The kitchen, once a symbol of her authority, now felt empty and silent. For the first time in years, Lugweta let her guard down. Her tough exterior cracked, and tears filled her eyes. She whispered to herself, "I lost a man who only ever loved me, because I thought power was about fear." The realization hit her hard. She had been so focused on controlling Dambalo through fear and intimidation that she had never stopped to understand his heart, his kindness, his silent suffering. She had mistaken power for control, and now it had all slipped away. In that moment, sitting alone in the very place where she had once been so proud and unchallenged, Lugweta felt the full weight of her downfall. She had built her world on fear, and now, with the world watching, she had lost everything. The power she once thought she wielded so effortlessly was now gone. She was left with nothing but regret. Lugweta walked slowly toward the small home where Dambalo now lived with his mother, Mama Ndole. Her heart weighed heavy, and her steps felt uncertain. The pride that had once filled her chest was gone, replaced by a deep emptiness. Her eyes, swollen from days of crying, seemed unable to escape the guilt that weighed her down. In her hands, she carried the same bowl that Dambalo had once dropped, the one she had slapped him in front of everyone, the one that had symbolized her dominance. Now, it seemed to carry the weight of all her regret. When she reached the door, her hand trembled as she knocked softly. Mama Ndole opened it with a knowing look, stepping aside to let her in. The air was thick with the silence of broken relationships. Lugweta entered the small, modest home, her gaze dropping to the floor. She hadn't expected this to be easy, but she wasn't prepared for the pain that gnawed at her heart as she saw Dambalo sitting quietly in the corner. Dambalo didn't look up at first, his focus on a piece of fabric he was stitching. But Lugweta's presence stirred something in him. He finally looked up, his tired eyes meeting hers. There was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet strength that she hadn't seen before. Without a word, she dropped to her knees before him. Tears spilled from her eyes as she spoke, her voice shaky and full of emotion. "Forgive me, Dambalo. I thought you were weak, but you were the strongest man I ever knew. I treated you like nothing. I thought controlling you made me powerful, but now I see. You were the one who held everything together. I was the one who was weak." The words felt like a weight lifting from her chest, but they also felt like an admission of everything she had lost. She had once believed that power came from fear, that strength meant dominating others. But now, after losing everything she once held dear, she saw the truth. True strength was in love, patience, and understanding, and she had failed to see that for so long. Dambalo sat quietly, his heart torn between the pain of the past and the healing of the present. He had endured so much under her harsh rule, yet here she was, kneeling before him, asking for forgiveness. For a moment, he was silent, the sting of old wounds still fresh. But as he looked at her, he realized something profound. Forgiveness was the key to healing, for both of them. Finally, he spoke softly, his voice steady and calm, but full of understanding. "I already forgave you, Lugweta, but now, I forgive myself too." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Dambalo had suffered in silence for so long, believing he was powerless, believing he was at fault. But now, he realized that he had never been the one to blame. The forgiveness he extended wasn't just for her, it was for himself too, for all the years he had spent trapped in fear and silence. Lugweta's sobs quieted as she looked at him. In that moment, she saw the man she had once overlooked, the man who had loved her despite everything, and for the first time, she understood the true meaning of strength. not the kind that demands respect through fear, but the kind that is born from humility, patience, and love. Months passed after the intense confrontation, and life in Zumbari slowly began to shift. Dambalo, once the quiet man in the shadows, had found a new strength, not in his muscles or his anger, but in his peace. He reopened his tailoring shop, but this time he renamed it Crown and Courage. The shop, which had once been a place of quiet suffering, became a symbol of his newfound empowerment. It wasn't just a business, it was a reflection of the man he had become, a man who had endured the worst and emerged stronger, not by fighting back with violence, but by embracing his own truth. Dambalo didn't just return to his work as a tailor, he became a voice for others who suffered in silence, especially men who experienced emotional abuse. He began speaking at community centers, sharing his story with anyone who would listen. He opened the doors for men to talk about what they had been through, to speak of their pain, and to heal. His voice echoed across Zumbari, reaching the ears of those who had never thought about emotional abuse from a man's perspective. His words were simple but powerful. True strength is not in silence or submission, but in finding the courage to speak up and stand tall. On the other side, Lugweta, now a changed woman, started her own journey of self-reflection and growth. She joined a women's counseling group where she learned about the dangers of pride, control, and the misuse of power. She spoke candidly about her own mistakes and the damage she had caused, warning others about how pride could destroy the very things you hold dear. As she shared her story, she realized that her desire for power had made her blind to the love and respect she had once taken for granted. Her journey wasn't easy, but it was necessary for her own healing. Slowly, she started to rebuild her relationships, including her strained bond with her daughter, Ndera, who was learning to forgive and understand her mother's pain. The village of Zumbari began to see Dambalo in a new light. The tailor, who had once been the laughingstock of the village, was now regarded with deep respect. His transformation had inspired not just men, but everyone around him. He was no longer the man who bowed his head in shame or fear. He was the man who wore his crown, not made of gold or jewels, but stitched with dignity, strength, and peace. He had learned that real strength was not about how loud you could shout or how hard you could fight, but in how deeply you could love and how bravely you could rise after being knocked down. In Zumbari, Dambalo's crown was not just a symbol of his past, but of the future he was helping to create, a future where love, respect, and understanding would triumph over pride, power, and control. It was a crown that didn't demand fear, but earned respect through kindness, courage, and the will to stand tall, even in the face of the hardest challenges. Dambalo's journey is one of incredible strength, courage, and redemption. It reminds us that true power lies not in how we control others, but in how we rise above our struggles and embrace love and peace. If you've ever faced adversity or felt trapped in a situation that seemed impossible to overcome, Dambalo's story is a testament to the power of speaking up, standing tall, and knowing that change is possible, even when the odds are against you. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in the power of transformation and healing, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are so many silent sufferers out there, and together, we can help them find their voice. Let's spread this message of hope, strength, and resilience. Don't forget to hit that like button if you believe that love and peace are the real sources of power. Share this video with your loved ones to remind them that no matter how difficult the journey, there's always a way out. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories that inspire change and transformation. Thank you for being part of this incredible journey.